I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this webinar on climate change and agriculture in Southern Illinois. My name is Jennifer Paulson. I'm the Executive Director of FoodWorks. And I want to thank also our guest speakers for being here today, Trent Ford, Jill Rendleman, and Amanda Pankau. Climate change has been a growing issue in agriculture and the rest of society for quite some time. In January, we held an annual meeting of FoodWorks and the Southern Illinois Farming Alliance, and this year we joined forces with the Idea Farm Network for that meeting as well. And in this room full of farmers and food producers and local food supporters, we asked what was on folks' minds for 2020, and climate change was a resounding answer. Of course, this was before COVID-19, but now more than ever, we need food producers and farmers who are resilient as possible. So I'm very excited to be able to share some information today on what climate change is going to look like in Southern Illinois. We have a unique landscape and a unique climate within Illinois. So this virtual field day comes about as a collaboration between FoodWorks and Prairie Rivers Network. I want to thank everyone from both organizations who worked to make this happen. This is also a collaboration of two peer-to-peer farmer networks, the Southern Illinois Farming Alliance and the Idea Farm Network. And I'd like to put links to both of those into the chat in just a moment so that you can check them out for yourself if you haven't heard about them. This year, these two networks have been working together to help farmers in Southern Illinois connect through gatherings, workshops, field days, including this virtual field day. The Idea Farm Network also has a very active listserv option. It's a very supportive community. It spans across the state of Illinois and through the Midwest, and it's a wonderful place where folks can be asking questions, farmers can be sharing their experiences with incorporating regenerative farming practices. So I encourage you, if you are a person who grows food or fiber or farms really in any way, I encourage you to check out both of these networks and consider joining them. A little bit of housekeeping before we go too far. I ask that everyone please stay muted. Also, if you have questions or comments along the way, please use the chat function, which is at the very bottom center of your screen. There's a little text bubble there, and if you click on that, that will get you to a place where you can type in your questions. At the end after our speakers have had a chance to share, we'll have a Q&A session, and that'll be facilitated by Libby Irvin of FoodWorks and Kim Ernst-Pitcher from Prairie Rivers Network. Please do refrain from side conversations in the chat. And I also want to let everyone know that this webinar is going to be recorded, so we will be sharing out that recording afterwards. A little other thing, at in-person events, we often will pass the hat or set out a donation jar, asking folks if they have a few bucks to help support these events, to help support future events like this. So if you find value in tonight's virtual field day, please consider making a small donation, and I will put the link to that in our chat as well. So let's get to it. I'm really excited to announce our speakers tonight. We have hydroclimatologist Dr. Trent Ford. He is the current Illinois State Climatologist, and as our state climatologist, he provides weather and climate data, maps and information for Illinois citizens, stakeholders, government agencies, and policymakers. He also conducts research on the climate system, extreme climate events, monitors current conditions, studies future climate change, and acts as the state's authoritative spokesperson on climate science. He's a native of Roanoke, Illinois. He earned his bachelor's degree in geography from Illinois State University before he completed his master's and PhD at Texas A&M University. And previous to his current position, He was an assistant professor at the Department of Geography and Environmental Resources at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. We also have tonight Jill Rendleman. She is the farmer of All Seasons Farm in Cobden, Illinois. She'll be sharing on-the-ground experiences from her certified organic farm that focuses on specialty crops. She'll be discussing what practices are being implemented on her farm to adapt to climate change. Our final speaker tonight is Amanda Pankau. She is an energy campaign coordinator with Prairie Rivers Network, where she works to decrease pollution from fossil fuels and advance renewable energy and other climate solutions. She also has a passion for local and sustainable food systems. She served as a volunteer and board member of FoodWorks from 2010 to 2017, and now she manages the Monticello Farmers Market in Central Illinois. And with that, I will turn it over to Trent.
Okay, so give me a thumbs up, those of you that can see, if you can see my screen here. Okay, good, and you can hear me too. All right. So, so thank you for inviting me to come speak today. Yeah, really excited to discuss the climate change with everybody. What I'm going to do today is provide a broad overview on climate change and some of the impacts that we've seen or projected to see on agriculture, specifically focusing on Southern Illinois. So I can't lecture about climate change without covering some of the basic science. So what I'm showing here, this figure is kind of a simple schematic of the Earth's energy budget. So we get all or the vast majority of our initial energy from the sun. And most of the atmosphere allows that shortwave energy from the sun to come down to the surface where it's used for different processes, and then among other things, re-emitted as a long wave or what's called terrestrial radiation. Now, certain gases in the atmosphere, known colloquially as greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, which is CH4, and the vapor form of water, H2O, they allow the shortwave radiation to come in and enter the Earth system, but absorb the outgoing long-wave radiation. At the same time, the concentration of these gases, carbon dioxide in particular, varies in time. So it's not like the oxygen and nitrogen where the concentration doesn't vary much. Carbon dioxide concentration varies quite a bit. So the more concentration, or excuse me, the more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, generally speaking, the more energy that's kept here on Earth, and therefore the change in the temperature. Now, although methane and water vapor do play an important role in the Earth's greenhouse effect, as it's called, carbon dioxide really drives the bus. So this is what we've seen over the last 50 to 60 years since taking direct observations of carbon dioxide concentrations on Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. You can see that trend line consistently increasing carbon dioxide concentrations. So we had concentrations of 300 to 320 parts per million back in the 1950s and 60s. The latest number, which I haven't updated here, January 2020, was at 416 parts per million. So that consistent increase in carbon dioxide concentrations on Earth over the last 100 to 150 years or so comes along with an increase in the energy that's kept in the Earth system, and therefore an increase in the global average temperature. Right? And that's what this chart is showing here. So this is showing the temperature, the global average temperature expressed as an anomaly going all the way back to the late 1800s, all the way through the present. You can see that consistent increase that really started at about the turn of the 20th century. Now, what I'm showing here, this increase in the global average temperature, is what we know as global warming. Now, often you'll hear global warming and climate change used synonymously. That can end today. So global warming just describes the increase in global average temperatures, but it causes, through many different complex interactions, climate change. So what that means is that even though the world on its entirety, the global average temperature has increased, it doesn't mean that every place's climate has changed the same way. Because the climate system is so complex, as I'm showing with all of my circulation anomaly figures here, it gives me job security, but it also, what it means is that that increase in global average temperatures that I showed results in different changes, or has resulted in different changes in different regions' climates. So what I'm here to talk about today is how that global warming, how that increase in global average temperatures that's happened over the last 100 to 150 years has changed the climate in Southern Illinois and has resulted in impacts to agriculture. So when I talk about Southern Illinois, depending on who you ask, I mean, if you ask somebody in Chicago, it's pretty much everything south of I-80. But in this particular case, we're going to talk about Southern Illinois as the very southern two climate divisions or crop reporting districts, the Southwest Climate Division and then the Southeast Climate Division. So pretty much all counties south of I-64. So let's start with precipitation. Arguably the largest change and the largest impacts because of that change in Illinois' climate over the last 100 years has been in precipitation. So Southern Illinois has gotten wetter over the last 100 to 150 years. The Southern Illinois annual total precipitation has increased by about ½ inch per decade between 1895 and 2019. What I'm showing here in this chart on the right-hand side is annual total precipitation in the Southwest Climate Division, showing those blue bars. And you can see quite a bit of variability. And then that annual trend line there, showing about 0.47 inches per decade. Now that wetting trend, that increased precipitation trend, is not equal between seasons. I break it down here in the two climate divisions in Southern Illinois, Southwestern Illinois and Southeastern Illinois, breaking it down by season here. And you can see that these trends are all positive in every single season. So every season in Southern Illinois has gotten wetter over the last 100 to 150 years, but the trends in spring are orders of magnitude larger than they are in winter, summer, and fall. So the spring wetting trend is much larger than in winter and summer. And that's caused some pretty significant agricultural impacts because of the timing of that. Now, taking an individual station's precipitation record, this is from Carbondale here. What this is showing is the 5-year average annual precipitation totals going all the way back to 1910 when they started taking consistent precipitation observations there in Carbondale. The green bars here are showing 5-year periods with above average precipitation, that are wetter than average 5-year periods. And the gray bars are showing the drier than average. What this does is it helps smooth out some of that variability. And what it shows is that going all the way back to the 1990 to 95 5-year time period, we've only had one 5-year time period that has been drier than average. And that's this gray bar here. And that's pretty much because of the 2012 drought. Other than that, every other 5-year period over the last 30 to 35 years has been wetter than average. So really what we've had, especially going back to the 1990s, is an unprecedented wet period in Southern Illinois. At the same time, it's not just total annual precipitation that's changed, but also how the form in that which precipitation takes. So we've also seen an increase in the very heaviest precipitation. This is showing precipitation, the annual number of heavy precipitation days in only. So this is the number of the annual number of days in which a greater than or equal to 2 inches of precipitation falls in a 24-hour period of time. You can see this dash black bar here. This is showing the total annual average number of heavy precipitation events. So between 1900 and 2020, only has received a little bit more than 1 2-inch rainfall event per year. But you can see that really starting in the 1990s, you see a tremendous increase in the number of those heavy precipitation events. So the 30-year period between 1990 and 2019, we have an average that's almost double the longer time period. So we're not only getting more precipitation, but we're seeing a larger percentage of that total annual precipitation falling in these very heavy days. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means on the ground and hydrology, but overall it means that there's less yield of that precipitation as well as more runoff and a higher risk of flooding. So I want to kind of break it down a little bit into a couple of specific events to try to get a little bit more practical means of how things have changed as far as heavy precipitation. So interestingly enough, last year at the Illinois State Water Survey, we finished our assessment of changes in precipitation recurrence called Bulletin 70. So we did the revised Bulletin 70. The original Bulletin 70, which estimated precipitation recurrence, like the total of the 100-year precipitation event, for example, that was written in 1989. So 30 years later in 2019, we have the revised using more current data so we can get an idea of how much the probability of heavy precipitation events have changed over the last 30 years. So I take an example of Southern Illinois here in Chester. So between April 27th and May 6th of 2017, had about 11.5 inches of rain that fell in Chester over that time period. based on the probability estimated from the original study, the Bulletin 70 study back in 1989 versus what the new study in 2019, the probability of this type of event has doubled over that 30-year time period. So what was a 20-year event, meaning a 5% chance of that type of precipitation event happening any given year, is now a 10-year event, meaning that probability has doubled. And so these sorts of images and the impacts that that sort of event caused, the probability of that has doubled over that short time period. The chart that I'm showing here on the bottom left is showing a relationship that's pretty commonly known in climatology called the Clausius-Clapeyron equation. Basically what this is suggesting is that as temperature of air increases, the amount of water vapor that that air can hold increases exponentially. And that's partially explaining why we're seeing an increase in not only precipitation, but precipitation intensity with that increase in temperature. So because the air is warmer, particularly in the spring, it can, for lack of a better term, hold more water vapor, and therefore we get these more intense precipitation events. Another example, a little bit further north in Charleston there in Coles County, this year between January 10th and 12th, we had about 5.5 inches that fell in that 3-day period in Charleston. It flooded fields and the Kaskaskia River breached the Vandalia levee. The probability of this event has increased 4 times since the late 1980s. It was, based on the estimates in 1989, a 20-year precipitation event, again, meaning a 5% chance of it happening any given year. Based on the new estimates, this sort of event, having 5.5 inches fall in a 3-day period in the Charleston area, has now become a 5-year event, meaning it's a 20% chance of this sort of precipitation event happening any given year. And what's really incredible about this event is that it didn't happen in May, June, or July when we expect the most frequent intense precipitation in Illinois, but in January, where we wouldn't really expect this type of event to occur. So when we get more intense precipitation, what that means is even without a change in the total amount of precipitation that's falling in a year, if that precipitation falls in fewer but more intense events, that increases the runoff ratio. That's basically how much of that water is partitioned to run off into our streams as opposed to soaking into the soils. Kind of an example of showing that with data here, the table at the bottom is showing the estimates of the total precipitation averaged over different time periods in the Vermilion River watershed, the average stream flow, and then the estimated amount of evapotranspiration. So what Walt Kelly and his team did is they, for different time periods, calculated how much precipitation is falling over the Vermilion River watershed, and then how that precipitation is being partitioned. Is it into stream flow, into our streams, or is it being soaked into our soil and then evapotranspired back into the atmosphere? What we see is that between the early period, 1932 and 1964, and the later period, 1970 and 2016, the overall amount of precipitation over the Vermilion River watershed has increased by about 3.5 inches, pretty consistent with what we see in Southern Illinois as well. Over that time period, though, the amount of stream flow has increased to a larger magnitude, and actual evapotranspiration has decreased. What that means is, despite the increase in precipitation, that precipitation has actually yielded less surface storage and increased the total amount of runoff, which means that we have an increased risk of flooding. And then later on, when that water that would have normally soaked into the soil is no longer there, an increased risk of drought. And that's what we're seeing here. The map on the bottom is a recent study published in 2015. And every single station here in the blue triangle pointing upward observed a significant increase in flooding over the last 100 years. And so we're seeing all across Illinois, but particularly in Southern Illinois, along the major rivers, the Mississippi and the Ohio, as well as the Big Muddy and the smaller rivers, we're seeing an increase in flooding because of that increase in precipitation intensity, along with human-induced changes to the landscape. So that's really what we've seen over the last 100 years or so in Southern Illinois. We're looking at climate model projections of continued changes into the future. It's really more of the same. Now I'm pulling a neat tool here from the Climate Resilience Toolkit, which is a NOAA initiative from the federal government. This is just from Union County, just pulling an example. What these lines are showing here are projections from global climate models of changes in precipitation from the present time period all the way out to the end of the century, to 2100. What this is showing is that overall total annual precipitation is projected to continue to increase as it has over the last 100 years in Union County and across all of Southern Illinois. as is the frequency of extreme precipitation events. So we're seeing an increase not only in total annual precipitation, but also the projection showing that the increase in heavy precipitation or very intense precipitation events is also likely to increase towards the end of the century. Now, I'll talk about temperature in just a little bit. The certainty or the confidence in these projections is lower than it is for temperature. And the reason being is that, for many reasons actually, global climate models are unable to capture precipitation changes as easily as temperature changes. However, the consistency in model projections of continued wetting, particularly in the spring in Southern Illinois, does give some confidence that this is what we should continue to see. The changes in total annual precipitation, again, particularly in the spring, that means for wetter conditions and more intense precipitation. Also interesting, the projections of total annual precipitation or the changes in those total annual precipitation are not very sensitive to emissions. So these projections, the blue line and the red line, are run in the global climate models under different scenarios. Basically, do we continue to emit greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide at the rates that we have over the last 100 years, or do we curb or cut those emissions? And how does that change our projections? For precipitation, there is a difference between the high emission scenario that's shown in red and the low emission scenario in blue, but those differences really aren't significant in the overall context of model variability, meaning that pretty much irrespective of how many emissions or emission scenario between now and the end of the century, we're seeing that increase in precipitation. What I'm showing here is those projections broken down by month, because it's not just about the total annual precipitation, but when that precipitation falls. So for each calendar month, again, this is from Union County, the gray bar is showing the 1990 to 2019, the last 30-year average monthly total precipitation. And the blue bar here is showing the projections of the total monthly precipitation by the year 2050 under the low greenhouse gas emission scenario. And the green bar is that 2050 number under the high emission scenario. So again, you can see that there are differences between the blue bar and the green bar, but they're much smaller than if I were to show you this for temperature. Overall, what we see is that most months, with the exception of August and October, the projections show increased precipitation. However, the largest change relative to the last 30 years that are projected by the year 2050 are in March, April, and May, and then again in November and December. So the very edges of our growing season, but particularly in the spring, that's where we're seeing not only the largest historical changes in precipitation, but also the most consistent projections of continued changes. So it's very likely that as we continue into the 21st century, towards the end of the 21st century, we'll continue to see increased precipitation in Southern Illinois, particularly in that spring, April, May time period. Now, so that's the bad news. Good news is for drought. So the complexity of drought complicates its measure and projection. It's not as easy as just total annual precipitation or monthly precipitation. If I use the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is a pretty commonly used drought metric, extreme drought, which is a Palmer Drought Severity Index value of less than -4, that's been reached in Illinois statewide only 7 times since 1895, but only twice since 1965. So really only twice since 1965 have we been in what we can consider an extreme drought by the Palmer Drought Severity Index metrics. What I'm showing here on the bottom left is monthly Palmer Drought Severity Index values from the Southeast Climate Division. The blue shows relatively wet periods. The red shows prolonged drought. So you can see really since the mid-1980s, we've had prolonged wet periods with a few droughts sprinkled in, but they haven't been very long-lived. If I run this data set over with a 30-year smoothing window, that's what we get on the right-hand side, which shows that pretty much since the mid-1970s, we've been in this prolonged, very wet time period. And this is really that climate change signal. So what that means is that the latter half of the 20th century and the first 2 decades of the 21st century, we have not seen these multi-year droughts happening nearly as frequently as we did in the early part of the 20th century. Really, the droughts since the mid-1980s, we can think of the 1988 drought, the 2005 drought, and the 2012 drought, those have been intense but short-lived. They've really only lasted 1 growing season, and then by the next season, we're back to normal. So we really haven't seen the prolonged droughts in the 1930s and 50s, and that is because of that increased precipitation. With that being said, what we have seen is an increase in the frequency of these intense but short-lived droughts. Now, I referenced 2012. Interestingly enough, even though we think of 2019 last year as this very wet year with this prolonged flooding, we did actually have some pretty intense but short-lived drought in southern Illinois. So what I'm showing on the left-hand side here is monthly precipitation from Murfreesboro. This is expressed as a departure from normal. The blue bars show months that were wetter than normal from last year. The red bars are drier than normal. So in Murphy, we had April, May, and June that were much wetter than average. Actually, June was 4 inches wetter than average in Murfreesboro last year. And then just a couple months later, we had September, which was one of the driest Septembers on record. And actually, guys, we get further south into Pope and Pulaski counties and Alexander counties, it was the driest September on record. So you can see how quickly we went from extreme wet to extreme dry. I'm showing that here in 3 different US Drought Monitor maps. Now this is a product that's updated weekly. If we look at the September 10th map from last year, there's a little bit of drought in the I-74 corridor in central Illinois, but nothing in southern Illinois. If we fast forward a few weeks later, October 3rd, pretty much every county south of I-64 is in moderate drought, and a little bit of Hardin and Gallatin counties are in severe drought. And then 4 weeks later, no drought. So we had this very short but intense time period where in September, essentially parts of southern Illinois didn't see any rain. And that had its own agricultural impacts, despite the fact that the 6 months previous were some of the wettest on record. And so some of the more new kind of cutting edge climate research is suggesting that this, what some people call precipitation whiplash, this kind of rapid transition in precipitation extremes from very, very wet to very, very dry, is actually increasing across a large swath of the southern Midwest, including the southern part of Illinois. So to kind of summarize some of the agricultural impacts we've seen from precipitation changes, really the biggest story is more precipitation and more extreme precipitation. That increases runoff, erosion, and of course the agricultural impacts that come along with that. So all seasons have been getting wetter, but the largest trends have been in spring. And spring, of course, is our wettest season anyway, meaning that we've seen that increased flooding in spring because of that. The recurrence intervals of the very heaviest precipitation events are shortening, which means we're seeing them more often, meaning more runoff and more flooding and more inundation of fields. Projections indicate that these trends that we've seen over the last 100 years should continue in future decades, again, especially in the spring. That's where we really see the projections align. We've also seen these swings or these rapid transitions from pluvial, very wet, to drought, and then in some cases back to pluvial, back to very wet conditions. There is an apparent increasing trend of these short-term swings from very wet to very dry in southern Illinois. However, that's really at the very cutting edge of climate research. So the causes of that and therefore the predictability of that are still unclear. Okay, so let's pivot to temperature. Although the impacts of changes in temperature over the last 100 years have not been as pronounced as precipitation, they are still there. So Illinois, like most of the country, has gotten warmer over the last 150 years. So annual average temperature has increased by about 1/10 degree Fahrenheit per decade between 1895 and 2019. I'm showing annual average temperature here on this chart with the black line showing that long-term trend. Daily minimum temperatures, although, have been increasing far more than daily maximum temperatures, and that is particularly the case in summer. So I break down not only the temperature change over the last 120 years or so by season here in this table on the bottom left, but also by the type of temperature. So daily mean temperature, daily maximum temperature, daily minimum temperature. What we can see is that in spring and winter, mean, maximum, and minimum temperatures are all increasing, and to a larger extent, a larger magnitude than we see in summer and fall. So winters and springs have been getting much warmer, or warmer at a higher rate than have summer and fall. What we see in summer is actually this interesting dichotomy that matches pretty much the rest of the Midwest, where we see the maximum temperatures over the last 100 years have actually been slightly cooling. Now, this trend is not statistically significant, but what we can say is there hasn't been a long-term warming trend in summer maximum temperatures. A lot of that has been due to increased humidity in the summertime. What we have seen is a pronounced increase in summertime minimum temperatures. So we're not getting as many very hot days in the summer in southern Illinois, but we are getting more warm nights, and that does tend to have its own unique agricultural impacts. When we think of, especially for specialty crops, the impact of freeze, and we can think of just this year when we had that incredible late freeze earlier this month. What I'm showing on the left-hand side is the last spring freeze date, and this is coming from Carbondale. And on the right-hand side is the first fall freeze date going all the way back to 1910. And what we're seeing is that the first spring freeze date has a long-term trend shifting earlier in the growing season, a trend of about half a day per decade, meaning we're seeing that last freeze in Southern Illinois earlier in the spring. So it's increasing the amount of time between the last spring freeze and the first fall freeze. We actually see the opposite trend in the first fall freeze. Our first fall freeze over the last 100 years or so has actually been trending earlier in the fall. However, I need to preface this by saying that the vast majority of this linear trend is driven by some pretty extreme cold falls that we had in the 1970s and 80s. So if you look at this time series, there's a lot of variability. But really, since the early 1990s, we've seen this drop off, this strong decreasing trend in the date of the first fall freeze. So what that means is that really over the last 30 years, our growing season, if you can, I guess, measure that by the length of time that elapses between the last spring freeze and the first fall freeze, it's grown by about 10 days over the last 30 years. So overall, we're seeing fewer late spring freezes and fewer early fall freezes. However, as we can say, despite that warming trend in overall temperature, we can still have the potential for a late season freeze like we had this year. And the insidiousness of that is that when we have a spring like we had this year, that February and March in particular were much warmer than normal, that tends to increase phenology. It tends to wake the plants up earlier, and then we still have the potential for that late spring freeze, which can cause even more damage because of that increased warming. Along with the change in temperature, soils have responded. So this is showing us, a plot on the right is showing 4-inch soil temperature under sod from Belleville going all the way back to 1990. I'm just showing October here, but it's pretty much the same trend for every month. We see an increasing trend of about 1/10 of a degree Fahrenheit per year in 4-inch soil temperatures in October in Belleville. So in response to warming air temperature, soils have warmed as well. So we've been able to reach those particular thresholds for planting and growing earlier in the spring and to extend later in the fall because of that increased warming. Along with that increase in temperature, we're also seeing an increase in evaporative demand or evaporation of moisture from the soil. And so what I'm showing here are increased evapotranspirations, so essentially evaporation from 1990 until 2019 from Dixon Springs there in Southern Illinois. And overall, we're seeing a trend of about an additional 1.5 inches per decade of evaporation. So even though we're seeing increased precipitation, we're also seeing increased evaporation at the same time. Now, if we think about water balance of an area, what I'm showing is the precipitation, monthly precipitation minus evapotranspiration, right? So how much falls to the soil versus how much is taken back up by evaporation to the atmosphere. And these data are from observations in Olney. So the green bars here, this is showing just calendar year. The green bars are showing overall over the last 30 years, months in which we see more precipitation than we do evaporation. So overall, we have a net positive water balance. The gray bars are where we're seeing a negative water balance. So anybody who grows up in Illinois, we know this, right? We gain water, we have a positive water balance between the fall and the spring, between October and April, and we get more evaporation than we do precipitation in the summertime. When we think about the trends over the last 30 years, now I shift to this figure. Green bars in this figure are showing months where that difference between precipitation and evaporation are increasing. So in every single month except for January, May, and November, we're actually seeing an increase in that difference between precipitation and evapotranspiration, meaning that no longer are we seeing in the later part of the summer, August, September, and October, we're not seeing evaporation outweighing precipitation. Actually, we can actually add to this, 6 out of the last 9 Septembers and only had a positive water balance despite the fact that we had very warm Septembers. So because of that increase in precipitation, it's actually outweighing the increase in evapotranspiration, meaning we actually have more positive water balance in the soil. So to end, we're going to talk a little bit about projections of future changes to temperature. This is just from Williamson County, that same figure that I showed you from Union County for precipitation. This is Williamson County for temperature. So we can see here again, model projections of changes in average daily maximum temperature from the present period all the way out to 2100. Certainly relative to the precipitation plot that I showed you before, we're seeing that the models converge towards an increase in temperature. So there's very high confidence of continued positive temperature changes, warming throughout this century. And the projections show rapid increases in daily maximum temperature, irrespective of emission scenario. So whether we continue to emit at the same levels that we have over the last 100 years, or we curb emissions, we still see those increases in temperature. However, unlike precipitation, we see a gap begin to form between the red line and the blue line right around the midpoint of the century. What that's showing is that how much warming we get by the end of this century is very strongly tied to the emission scenario, meaning that here in Southern Illinois, we're locked in. It is very likely we will continue to see increased temperatures throughout the year in every single season. However, the magnitude and extent of that warming is very much dependent on the emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases between now and the middle part of this century. So overall, lots of information, and I'm really looking forward to question and answer to try to dig into this more and to try to get some individual perspectives here. But let me provide a little bit of a summary as well as my contact information where you can reach me. So climate change, present and future, pose a significant issue for agriculture in Southern Illinois. Over the last 30 years in particular, we've seen more precipitation, increased precipitation intensity. That's caused considerable soil erosion, runoff, and flooding issues. Increased temperature, particularly in the winter and spring, have expanded the growing season, increased the amount of time between the last spring frost and the first fall frost. However, it's also increased the prevalence of ag pests, disease, and invasive species. Increased evaporation driven by higher temperatures haven't really been an issue necessarily because we've seen that additional precipitation even in the summertime. However, when we don't get that precipitation in August and September, the warmer temperatures during that time period can intensify dryness. We saw that last year. Last year, there were areas of Southern Illinois that got less than half an inch of precipitation in September, which is less than 5% of normal. However, that dryness was exacerbated or intensified because September also was very, very warm. And that is a trend that will continue into the future. Future climate projections show very high confidence that temperatures will continue to increase in Illinois. Of course, that impacts evaporation. That can exacerbate dry conditions during drought. It increases soil temperatures. It increases soil temperature in the wintertime, which can increase the prevalence of those pests and disease. But in the summertime and the fall, it can increase the amount of time that your plants have to accumulate growing hours. It also means that we're increasing prevalence for pests and for specialty crop growers, decreasing the number of chill hours that we're accumulating over the wintertime. Overall, it's highly likely that as temperatures increase, precipitation will also continue to increase in the spring, which means that the issues related to excess water, flooding issues that we've seen over the last 30 years or so, and the soil erosion and nutrient runoff that come along with them will likely continue into the future. So again, I want to thank you so much for allowing me to come talk to you all today, and all my contact information is there, but of course, Jen and Amanda and the rest will have that information as well. So thank you again, and I'm happy to take any sort of questions during the Q&A part.
Thank you, Trent. And like you said, if you have questions for Trent, please put them in the chat window. The button is at the bottom of your screen, and we will get back to those again at the end of the presentation. So now we're going to hear from Jill Rendleman at All Seasons Farm.
All right, welcome everyone. And thank you, Trent. I was wondering if all of this was just in my imagination, but it really has been happening. So today I was going to talk a little bit about, it's really easy, I think, to listen to, be a farmer or be a homesteader, gardener, and listen to what Trent is saying and saying, oh my gosh, this is going to be really difficult. But I think what I'm going to talk about is things that we can do to adapt and be resilient to this climate change. We are particularly lucky, I think, in Southern Illinois to have some conditions in our landscape. I mean, we have high rolling hills, we have nutrient dense soils with our clays, and we have a lot of wind, airflow that's nice between these hills. We do have a lot of bottomland, that's true, but I think most small farmers are going to land that is more rolling and kind of set up for the runoff, the water, etc. So we're going to embrace these things. We're not going to be afraid of them. We're going to embrace this environmental change. I mean, now is really, I think, our time. I mean, it is the time for small farms. Ideally, we've been set up for the unpredictable. We do not have, we're not formulaic farming. Mentally, we have been kind of barraged with a little bit of everything over the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, and we've had to make up things as we go along. So we're used to change and we're used to adapting to things. Financially, most of us do not have a huge amount invested. I mean, we're talking millions and millions of dollars. Relatively speaking, yes, we have a lot of ourselves and a lot of our money invested in our operations, but it's not so much that we can't overcome that. And then operationally too, as far as how we deal just working from day to day, I think, we can be adaptable. So, but I think adapting quickly is the key. I mean, when I listened to Trent and I saw the charts, I mean, it wasn't so much where the lines are going, it was the fact that there was so much up and down. And that is what we're experiencing, is that, you have to be ready to every day turn on a dime. I mean, you have to be watching your weather reports and be ready for anything at any time and constantly be aware of what's going on in your environment. A little bit about our farm. We really focus on trying to grow really high quality food that's nutrient dense. We do have spring-fed irrigation. We're lucky to be surrounded by a woods for wind and weather protection. We have gently rolling hills and a little higher elevation in the 700s. A lot of south-facing slopes, or that's where we put our plots, is on our south-facing slopes. And we don't have a lot of acreage in our fruit and vegetable plots. We only have about 4 acres, and it's really surrounded by the woods. So we have a lot of protection. And I think there's a lot of properties like this in Southern Illinois. And so it makes it, a good place to have a small farm and to be adaptable to these conditions. One of the things that I want to make, I've worked to make clear to other farmers and to consumers, is that we can grow really high quality food in Southern Illinois if we use the right techniques. So this is just some of the things that we grow on our farms. And these are wild, so. So what we've experienced at all seasons is the loss of predictability of seasonal patterns. It used to be that we could say, oh, well, this is going to happen in April, and this type of thing will happen in June, and this type of thing will happen in July, but that doesn't happen anymore. As Trent mentioned, we had an extreme frost, I think it was May 7th, was it? this year, and we were prepared for it. I'd covered a lot of things, but I'd never had, our potatoes were up about 6 or 8 inches, and I wasn't really ready. I hadn't covered the potatoes, but luckily they're a root crop. So, but we're seeing extreme fluctuations in temperature, rainfall, wind events, and a lot of flood extremes. So, since I've been farming here on this property, we've seen the highest and lowest rainfall and the highest and lowest temperatures in the county history, just in a 10-year period. So temperatures and rainfall outside of the USDA zone criteria is basically what we're seeing. So what can we do about it? Well, I think resilience, or adapting quickly to these things, really starts with the soil. And so you've heard me say this before, but the plants that can withstand extreme weather fluctuations and pests are healthy, well-nourished plants. So we really have to go well beyond this soil testing for N, P, and K. I mean, we need to go to tests that test for micronutrients. We need to know about the number, type, and diversity of microbes that we have in our soil. We need to test for organic matter. Some of us have gotten a little carried away with the organic matter, and as we have, a lot more drying or hot, dry periods, and we need to retain that moisture in the soil. And so we need to keep a close eye that we're not getting over that 6% moisture in our soil, or organic matter in our soil. So, and then we also need to check for worms and beneficial fungus. So soil, I mean, it's a living thing. We get our soil tests done at Alvey Labs, also known as Agri-Energy Resources, or they partner together, these two groups. The Alvey Labs does the testing, and the Agri-Energy Resources provides detailed look at each of your micronutrients, and they give you these nice little charts that says, are you low, high, or medium? You don't have to be Dr. Trent to understand these reports. They're pretty easy to understand. And they will also you can't see it on the far right of this chart or this report, is a suggestion about what types of things you can add to your soil or do to your soil to correct the problem. So we don't want to add too much organic matter. And on the other hand, a lot of people, especially my farmer friends up north, often talk about, well, how can you farm in that dry clay soil? Well, when you look at your nutrient content of, our clay soils, it's pretty amazing, and we're pretty lucky to have it. One of the things that we've done, it's just sort of come out of habit and out of necessity, I guess, but I have my radar phone app, and I have the Weather Channel phone app. And then I also have like WSIL and the local weather stations as well, their apps on my phone. So I'm constantly looking at the weather and what's going on, so that I can see these, all of a sudden transforming weather patterns that, are leading to nighttime frosts that we might not otherwise be aware of if we weren't checking our phones or our, weather maps close enough. I probably look at my radar about 3 times a day. And, you get pretty good at this stuff about being able to predict what is going to happen. The more often you look at your radar screens and your weather reports, the better you'll get at being able to predict what is going to happen, or if it's going to hit you or not. So a lot of times we play this game on the farm where we try to guess, okay, when is it going to rain? When is the temperature going to change to this? You know, because we've all got our phones out and we're all doing our calculations and making our best guess. So we make it kind of a fun thing. A special thing to watch, if you're not careful, you can forget about your nighttime temperatures. So always, especially when you look at the Weather Channel app on your phone, you'll find that the nighttime temperatures are the things I look at the most, because I really want to see if something's going to go below 35 for a long period of time, 3 or 4 hours, or if it's going to go above 85, because that means I have to stay up late and close the high tunnels late. Another practical idea, right now it's really important to order your seed very early and your other inputs as well. I mean, seed is in very high demand and there's a lot of distribution problems because of the COVID. So like right now, you should be thinking about what you're going to plant next year, and you know, go to wherever your main 2 or 3 providers of that kind of seed is and be looking to see if they have it, because as soon as they have it, you probably ought to place an order for it. So it used to be that we would wait until January after Christmas and, you know, go look at all the seed providers and, you know, have our pick of what we wanted. Well, those days are gone, you know, so it's also important, I think, because of the variabilities in temperature and other conditions, that you go to a known source for seed. A lot of times I hear people saying, oh, well, I'd like to save my own seed or get seed from someplace they've never heard of before, but they saw it on the internet, and invariably this turns out to be a bad decision. So get comfortable with a known seed source and use it. When you look at your seed varieties, think about adding early, medium, and late varieties. All you have to do is look at your days to maturity on the you know, on the seed packet or in the description, and it will tell you. So that's really important. There's a lot of new organic hybrids that are out, which will withstand cold, heat, wet, and don't discount those. But because they're new, you may want to let them go for a year, and then the next year, you know, see what farmers' experience were with them. But there are a lot of good changes being made in the organic hybrids. Also, a lot of times people forget that we have determinate and indeterminate varieties of seed. And so, for example, with tomatoes here on our farm, we want both determinate and indeterminate. So determinate seed pretty well produces a plant that's going to produce all at once. Okay, so it's going to be all ready almost, you know, at the same time, and then it's going to be gone. Whereas indeterminate varieties, which are generally your heirlooms and things like that, which we tend to focus on, they're more lasting and they're more durable, but because they are producing over a longer period of time, they're more at risk for one of the weather factors. So by using both determinate and indeterminate varieties, you can reduce your risk there. Create shade. I mean, vegetables. I always thought vegetables liked all heat, all sun, all day long, but it's not true. They like shade, and the studies show that most vegetables are happier with about 35% shade. Maybe corn, soybeans, and wheat like sun all day long, but vegetables and fruits like a little shade. So we want to do things that cool plants and cool the soil. So if you can plant small trees around your plots, they're hard to till around, etc., but you know, they're going to pay off over time. In this picture, you can see a little pear tree we planted in a plot, and then on the paths we cover the paths with clover or radishes or something, but we try to have no blank spots of soil because that's just a place where evaporation can occur and where the sun can just bake the soil and warm it up to a place that the plants aren't happy. Your raised beds are a really good idea. Based upon what we just heard again from Trent, it kind of emphasizes that raised beds are a good idea. We want our rainwater to run off and not have flooded plots. Raised beds, as you can see down at the bottom at the end of this row of new zucchini, the path is really wet, and that's because the water has gone down, and ended up down at the bottom of the plot, but it's staying there, and it's not, it's not staying over the entire plot. It's just located in one spot. So prepare your beds in late fall. By the spring, it's not a good time to do it. So work on that in the fall. And then mulch heavily. That cools your soil, maintains moisture. Really be careful of straw. Straw is like a major mulch thing that we use on our farm, but you have to be careful not to get straw from somebody who produced wheat with Roundup, and they're now using Roundup and herbicides about 3 times in conventional wheat growing. So you have to really ask that question and know if the person you're dealing with is giving you an honest answer. High tunnels, just make sure you've got as many openings as possible. Roof vents, side vents, be able to open them anywhere you can at any time. The wind is blowing any direction. Modifications to high tunnels, it's a little bit of work, but it's not that expensive. You just have to do it. And if you've got places in your high tunnels that are keeping air or holding air in and not letting the wind through, then you might want to think about changing those. We open our high tunnels at dawn and close before dusk. If you open at dawn, you're letting out all the moisture that accumulates in the high tunnels during the evening. And if you don't open them up until 8 or 9 o'clock, you're going to have a lot more problems with fungus and mold, so you can't sleep late. So Morgan County Seed is a good place to look for high tunnel information. We use a lot of shade cloth, and we use a lot of agribon. Agribon is it's kind of a material that's white. So we have these things ready at all times. We don't put them up in a barn where it's not accessible or where it's going to be hard to get to. So when we were seeing this frost coming up, we were able to just climb up on a ladder, take down the agribon. We put it right over the shade cloth. And, we already had the bags out, so we were ready to go. So both shade cloth and agribon create, I would say, ideal environments. It's wind and rain protection, diffuses sunlight, protects against rabbits and some of the bigger grasshoppers and things. And if you want to know how to do these low tunnels, Johnny's seed catalog has the tools. They're very inexpensive to build, and there's plans and everything on Johnny's in YouTube. So if you have a seed house, you want to make sure that you've got a good place to cool down your seeding areas after February, because it's going to start getting really hot. The sun is getting more intense. So we built our seed house, and within a year we had put shade cloth all over it. And we generally leave it up all year now. If you notice in the middle of this picture, there's a warming light box. It's just kind of something that we made out of dog fencing material and hung some lights on it so that we can keep our seeds warm. Obviously, it's too expensive to heat a seed house all winter long. So if you have these little small spaces where you can heat things and Also, we use, and I should have put this in here, we use a lot of heat mats. So DeWitt is a good company to get shade cloth from, and they'll cut it to any specification. So one of the best things that I think you can do on the farm, I mean, as Trent mentioned, we're going to have a lot more pests and insect problems when you have the type of weather patterns we're seeing. So whereas soil health is our #1 insecticide, I think native plants are coming a close second. So we try to have as many of these around our farm as possible. It really works. It really attracts the insects, the wasps, the bees, and other things that go after the bad bugs. So, you know, they love cabbage worms and other bad pests. And I think Kim at Prairie Rivers Network has done a great job. I think she's on the panel here tonight, and she's a great resource if you want to know how to get started with that. So here's the reason we want to keep adapting and be resilient. It's basically, you know, it's our family, it's our friends, it's the people who work for us, it's the plants and animals around the farm. But we know it's a business. And so when you think about it as a business, you know, if somebody gave you these criteria that Trent just gave us and talked about, is this the kind of business you want to go into? You know, you have to really think about it hard, because it's going to take, I think, more of your time. It's going to be a little bit more stressful, and you're going to have to be ready all the time. I mean, farming is not a job anymore that you can go plant your stuff and then go take a vacation somewhere in the Smoky Mountains and come back and harvest everything. I mean, it's an everyday thing. So with that, that's my closing. Thank you, everyone, for allowing me to participate.
Thank you, Jill, for sharing all of that. Now we're going to hear from Amanda.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you very much, Trent, for joining us, and Jill. As Jennifer said, I'm Amanda Pankau. I'm an energy campaign coordinator with Prairie Rivers Network. So I work on issues of energy and climate, primarily in downstate Illinois. And I want to talk briefly tonight about agriculture and climate change mitigation. I only have about 5 or 15 minutes to cover a very broad topic. So I really hope to introduce folks to some resources and also maybe spur a conversation that many of us can pick up in the future. So for those who aren't familiar with Prairie Rivers Network, we're an environmental nonprofit in Illinois, and our mission is to protect water, heal land, and inspire change. Trent already covered this a bit, but let's just take a moment to review what the science tells us about climate change. So we know that the Earth has already warmed an average of 1 degree Celsius, and that human-caused greenhouse gas emissions are largely responsible for that warming. We know that if we continue with a business as usual scenario, that we could see an increase of 5 degrees or more by 2100. And we're already seeing some of those impacts of climate change, as Trent covered, and many of them are expected to be worse with increased warming. And I also just wanted to note that we all need to remember that the negative impacts of climate change will not be bore equally, and that many vulnerable communities and ecosystems are expected to be impacted disproportionately. So we heard from Jill, and she shared how her farm's already adapting to the impacts of climate change. And so my talk is called Agriculture and Climate Change Mitigation. So I just wanted to touch on the differences of these two words. Climate adaptation refers to what we do to deal with the impacts of climate change, to reduce harm to humans and natural systems. So at a small scale on Jill's farm, an adaptation strategy, as she mentioned, could be to utilize raised beds and mulching to prevent soil moisture levels, or to manage soil moisture levels during expected heavy rains or during periods of drought. At a larger scale, an adaptation strategy in the Midwest might be moving levees back along our large rivers and restoring wetlands to increase flood capacity and protect downstream communities from flooding. So we are going to have to find ways to manage the impacts of climate change that are unavoidable, and that's climate adaptation. But on the other hand, with a warming climate, there are going to be more impacts that are simply unmanageable, and we should be working to avoid those the best we can. Because humans are responsible for the emissions that are causing climate change, we have a chance to address the root of the problem, and this is climate change mitigation. So these are efforts to reduce greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere to slow warming, and we can do this two ways. We can reduce the source of those emissions, and we can sequester carbon dioxide by creating new carbon sinks. So before we move on and talk about agriculture's role in mitigation or climate solutions, let's just take a step back and examine agriculture's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. In the US, crop and livestock production contribute 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. The largest contributor comes from the way many farmers manage their soils. These practices tend to lead to an increased availability of nitrogen in the soil, and that results in emissions of nitrous oxide, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. The two other leaders in ag emissions come from the way we manage our livestock, and this includes methane from ruminant digestive processes, as well as the management of manure. So it's important to note here that when we say agriculture accounts for 10% of US greenhouse gas emissions, we're talking solely about crop and livestock production. We aren't taking into account emissions from the entire food system that include pre-production and post-production activities. So there are food system emissions that come from these other sectors. So from electricity, we have emissions from grain drying, greenhouse heating, refrigeration, transportation sector. We're moving ag inputs and outputs around. And from industry, we have the synthesis of inorganic fertilizers and ag food processing. This picture here is a picture I took this February. I was traveling from Monticello to Springfield, and so I'm north of Decatur, and you could see some of the emissions coming from Decatur's large ag food processing. So we know that, you know, from a food system perspective, this 10% isn't accounting for that. So I wanted to share some results from this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. So that's the IPCC. And so they released this report in 2018 to look at how our land contributes to climate change, and then in turn, how climate change affects our land. And this report found that if emissions from both pre and post-production activities are considered, the global food system is accountable for 21 to 37% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. We also have an industrial food system that's responsible for leading to further deforestation and land degradation. So it's very clear that changes to this system are needed if we're going to mitigate climate change. And I did want to point out too, I've shared kind of screenshots of the cover pages of some of these IPCC reports. You know, many of these reports are hundreds of pages. You would need to be Dr. Trent to understand some of the information in them. But I wanted to point out that most of these reports have what's called a summary for policymakers. And most of these reports also have very interactive web pages where you can get on and, you know, look at impacts to the Midwest or look at agriculture's role. So they're really user-friendly, and I'd encourage folks to check them out. So I mentioned that if we have a business as usual scenario, we're going to see an increase of more than 5 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100. So when we talk about climate mitigation or climate solutions, what is our goal? What are we working towards? So the Paris Agreement is actually a goal that we can work off of, and this is a global framework to avoid some of the most dangerous impacts of climate change by limiting global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius and pursuing efforts to keep it even closer to 1.5. So this particular report here was also from 2018, and the IPCC compared impacts of 2 versus 1.5 degrees of warming and found that the risks to natural and human systems are much higher for 2 degrees warming. So further evidence that the more we limit warming, the better we're going to protect ecosystems and human communities. And then this report also laid out emissions reduction goals and pathways, and said that to limit warming to below 2 degrees, we need rapid and far-reaching transitions in every sector, from energy to land to infrastructure, transportation, industry. And the report also said that the systems transmissions that must occur are unprecedented in scale, but not in speed. So what this means is that we know how to do most of these solutions, and we also know how to do them quickly. We just have to massively scale them up to meet our goals. So because we don't have a lot of time tonight, I did want to introduce you to some resources that I thought would be helpful for folks to dive into in the future. So we'll talk a little bit more about this particular resource that I have shown here, but I'd encourage folks to visit the website and dive in for yourself as well. So this is Project Drawdown, and it was an effort to identify and rank the top 100 solutions for mitigating climate change. The solutions are organized in these 9 sectors here. Each solution does one of 2 things. It either reduces greenhouse gas emissions or it sequesters carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere. There's a book that you can purchase, and then you can also visit drawdown.org to check out more info. Tonight, we're gonna just take a moment and look a little closer at some of the solutions that are outlined in the food, agriculture, and land use sector, as well as the land sink sector. Whoops. So these are some of the solutions that I pulled out of those 2 sectors that were relevant to agriculture and food systems in the Midwest. There were a few other solutions that were more applicable to other regions. The solutions shown on the left are solutions that provide an opportunity to shift away from industrial agriculture and land use practices and reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. And then the solutions in the brown box are solutions that are primarily an opportunity to create new sinks and sequester carbon dioxide. And then you can see there's some solutions that fall in the middle there that are in both categories. And we're going to take just a quick closer look at regenerative agriculture. So most people on the call probably know the false narrative that the world cannot be fed without the use of chemicals and synthetic fertilizers. And most of folks tonight probably have evidence to the contrary, that in fact the world cannot be fed unless we're feeding the soil. So regenerative agriculture refers to a suite of practices that work together to regenerate not only the land, soil, the water, and then support biodiversity and communities at the same time. And together, these practices, as most of you know, increase carbon-rich soil organic matter. So regenerative agriculture allows us to move away from conventional practices that are actually emitting greenhouse gases to a system that does just the opposite by drawing down carbon. It's estimated that at least 50% of the carbon in the Earth's soils has been released into the atmosphere over the past centuries. And so this quote I have here is from Project Drawdown, and I just think it perfectly summarizes a great message that bringing that carbon back home through regenerative agriculture is one of the greatest opportunities to address human and climate health. And then most farmers on the call tonight can probably tell us the other benefits of regenerative agriculture. It leads to deeper plant roots. Nutrient uptake improves, water retention increases, and plants become more pest resistant. And all of those things are also important for farmers and society as a whole to adapt to a changing climate. We need soils that can better handle extreme rain events or even the droughts. We need crops that are more pest resistant. So agricultural solutions are also unique in that they help us mitigate and also adapt to climate change. So I said earlier that we know how to quickly take up the solutions for reducing emissions, but we just need to do it at a massive scale. And in part, we can do that through public policy that either mandates, incentivizes, or removes barriers to these practices. Illinois has joined the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is a bipartisan coalition of governors committed to reducing greenhouse gases consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And to keep that promise, Illinois has very specific emission reduction goals that we want to meet by 2025. and yet we aren't on track to meet them. So what can we do? I wanted to mention one thing that I work a lot on, and that's something called the Clean Energy Jobs Act. This is a piece of legislation currently before our General Assembly that would reduce emissions from the electricity and transportation sectors. Prairie Rivers has worked closely with other organizations across the state as part of the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition, and we've worked with communities and policymakers over like a 3-year period to help inform this bill. And so if folks are interested in learning more or getting connected, I'd be happy to talk more about that. And while it doesn't impact or doesn't address emissions from the ag sector, as we talked about before, you know, there are many parts of our food system that are nested in those other pieces of the pie. And so we need to, you know, to have a sustainable food system, we need to be addressing all of those emissions. And finally, I think, and everyone on the call would probably agree that there is a huge untapped opportunity to involve Illinois farmers as a solution to climate change by reducing emissions from an industrial system and by bringing that carbon back home. And we have an opportunity to work together to answer this question of what do those policy solutions look like. And then I just wanted to leave folks with one more thing to do, way to get involved. Many listening tonight are farmers, and as Trent shared, your operations are and will be impacted by climate change. Many of you are already farming with regenerative practices in a way that's helping adapt and mitigate climate change. So I'd like to encourage you to tell your story, whether it's to customers at the farmers market, your neighbors, maybe your state or federal representatives, or in a letter to the editor or an op-ed in the local paper. Letting people know what you're experiencing on your farm, how it's impacting you, and what practices you're using to adapt and mitigate it. So the pictures I have here, the top one there is Funks Grove Farm invited U.S. Representative Rodney Davis out for a farm tour. And one of the main things they wanted to share with him that day was how their farm is being impacted by climate change. They produce maple syrup in Central Illinois. And then the picture there on the bottom is I came out to Farmer Jill's farm earlier this year with a video crew from the Clean Jobs Coalition to get some footage of her solar panels and hear how her farm has these sustainable practices that are helping in many ways. And then I've got the headline up there, which was a recent op-ed in the Southern that many people probably saw. And in this op-ed, they didn't even mention climate change, but they talked about the changes that farmers are experiencing and how soil and water conservation is more important than ever. And again, I wanted to kind of hope tonight is just the beginning of a conversation with many folks. So I have contact information here to share for myself and my coworker Kim, who works with many folks with Regenerate Illinois and the Idea Farm Network. Got Jennifer with FoodWorks email address, as well as a lot of websites and other places that get involved. So thank you very much.